Well, today I'm Mr. Rodder's neighborhood. Besides taking the garage hermit to the next level, I'm looking pretty sexy here with all, look, like I've been out here for weeks trying to get things done and caught up. So today we're going to actually test the oil system on our Super Stock small block Buick. So I'm back on the Super Stock. I finally got the pan fabricated. I got the window trays completed, and the crank scraper is all filed to fit. So I bolted it all together, and now we're ready to go and add some lubrication to this dude and check out our oiling system. So that's where we're at today. Also, I got a selfie stick, so you don't have to look at my nose anymore. All right, well, let me get the camera flipped around and we'll get started. All right, so here we go. I got everything set up to prime the engine. I actually got my start stand back from the junkyard Jet Cats. And that way, I was actually going to put this on the start stand and do it, and then something else came up. My buddy wanted to use the start stand for a small block Chevy, so I thought this was the next best thing. All right, so everything is assembled. I got even my V6 Buick timing pointer on there, and here's what the oil pan ended up looking like. So remember, that's a 300 Buick oil pan. I needed it for somewhat the mid-sump. It had to have this kick in the rear. It had to be more extreme than the regular 350 Buick because this is a rear steer car. So I went with the 350 or with the 300 pan to start it all off with, and then I cut and sectioned it. I moved the front portion of the sump forward 3 inches, and then I used a Buick 350 actual area here for the it actually had, so it had enough clearance. The 300 is actually flat across the bottom. So then I put these small block, well, it's actually not even a small block Chevy. Those wings right there are from Speedway Motors oil pan kit. So you can see the surgery lines here. This is the sump from the 300 Buick. This is the 350 Buick portion of the pan. So I had clearance on the stroke of the crank. It is different. If you look at a 300, it's flat across here, and the difference is why it has more radius there. I believe it's for more stroke. So it just gave it more clearance. Otherwise, they're really tight. And you can see the wings. I mean, it's not, I'm not a welder, I'm not a fabricator. I just had to kind of make ends meet here. Okay, so, but inside there you have all the other neat stuff. Valve covers completed. Right, ready to go. Intake manifold. It has been a long, hard road. I got this thing with a whole nother motor, and you know, the stock TA does not look like this anywhere. This is like lots of hours of porting. I've cut it down 1/2 inch, maybe closer to 3/4 right here from the center divider, and then I bull-nosed it, okay? And that way, it still works somewhat like a dual plane, but it gives you effects of a single plane by having a larger open plenum area. I'm also allowed to use a 1-inch spacer, so I will be using a 1-inch spacer. Now I did cut down into the runners here, big time. Matter of fact, this one here is really cut to the point where it got into these bolt holes. So that's a set screw with some thread sealant on it and Loctite. These are not that way, just that one is. So, yeah, this one's the same way. It's just not as pronounced, and that's because I can't reach it with the tool. All right, so flip it over. Here's where all the magic happens. All right, so you can't quite see it all. I glip-talled the bottom, right, which is basic and easy. I straightened all the runners as best as possible. There's quite a few dog legs, and then I got really scared of breaking through because I did go through at one point on the back. You can see here that the casting itself actually sagged when they pulled it out of the mold, so there's a dip in that divider. So this is filled up to where the epoxy is essentially makes it perfect with the gasket. Okay, same way on this side. It's not as bad on this side. But I did cut a dog leg out of there, and I opened up 1/4 inch. Now, let's see here. All right, sag, again, same spot. It's just on the opposite, or on the rear runners compared to the front. That divider sags, and so I had to fill it in with epoxy to straighten it all out. Then I epoxied some of the roof to straighten out the airflow. But if you go to the other side, you can see that the casting itself wasn't that great because it had those sags in there. And this is actually from the way it comes from TA. Now this is an older intake manifold. This is probably from the 90s. The older intake manifolds are identified by that, where it has Tomaszewski cast in there. But the earlier ones are probably, this is probably not so pronounced because they do CNC kind of gasket match them as they come from TA now. But this older one was originally just as cast. So this low spot here, I filled in with epoxy so that it was straight and it would match up with the gasket, right? So it's kind of where we're at with that one. It's the same way on this other one here. Sorry about that. But it wasn't as sag as it was on the other side in the center divides, but there still is some epoxy to straighten them out. So you can see some here. Okay, and then same way at the bottom where it was low. Okay, so I added in a little epoxy to straighten it up, and then here's where I got crazy and screwed up with the bit, so I filled that in. But yeah, that's my first time porting an intake manifold, so it's not an easy job. So if you're paying somebody and they say, oh, it's 600 bucks to do it, well, I'll tell you, I know why it is that kind of money, because these things are not easy to work with and they come with all kinds of imperfections. I'm sure if it's not a TA intake manifold that you're using, like say something that's super mass produced, like an Edelbrock Performer for a small block Chevrolet, it's probably even worse, to be honest with you. But I did get everything opened up quite a bit. I took a 1/4 of an inch material out of the back here. I cut out a 1/4 of an inch material here in the front on this side, and then we opened the plenum volume up. I cut it out about 1/8 of an inch here, and then radiused it all in. It does look okay. I'm kind of concerned about that edge, but it is kind of beveled, and I didn't want to break through the casting. So that's where we're at with the intake manifold. Back to this guy. This is where we're at now. So today we're just going to prime this dude up, and we're going to look for oil pressure over here on the oil pressure gauge. It's on the right side. All right. So I haven't put any oil in it yet, and when I do a brake, when I actually pre-lube them, and this is just something I want to verify, you know, that the oiling system is working. I've done so much work to these rocker arms. These are adjustable push rods. It has, and I threw a hint picture up the other day on the Facebook. This is the balance tube, okay? So on your Buicks, if you're not familiar with a Buick, they use the main oil galley is here on the driver's side of the motor, and it lubricates everything essentially in the engine. It does the mains, which then feed the rods. It also has a crossover here up front that feeds the passenger side, and then it does all your lifters, right? And then up top end, it does rockers and all that jazz. So normally there's a plug in the back of the block. Okay, and I'll show you where. All right, so right there's normally a plug. It's just a screw-in kind of pipe plug. And all I did was get a 1/4 inch fitting with a 1/4 inch compression fitting for this copper line. And then I'm running the copper line because this is supposed to be 1967 Super Stock, right? So when racers back in the 60s made stuff, it was made with hardware parts, like hardware store parts, right? So not like your typical Lowe's, but like the mom and pop's True Value. So I'm like, all right, well, I'll just stick to that kind of mantra, and what can I find? Instead of using a brake line or whatever anybody's using today that's steel, I figured it would have been made out of copper. This is how they used to make fuel lines back in the day, was copper. And so I made this whole thing out of copper, out of a refrigerator water kit that you hook up water inside of a refrigerator. It's 1/4 inch copper tube, and then it uses 1/4 inch fitting down at the bottom. So it's compression. I just wanted to have 2 joints. I could have probably put something here in the middle with a gauge, but I don't think it's really that necessary, because the more fittings you have, the more leak prone it's going to be. Okay, so I just wanted to have one solid piece of copper, and then it goes back to the second fitting in the back. It does look pretty cool. It gives it a retro vibe. All right, but we're gonna dump some oil in this dude. So when I do a break-in, I usually stick to this stuff right here. I have not ever had a problem with an engine using this Royal Purple break-in oil. Now I did break one in a year ago, or two, no, it was two, maybe 3 years ago. It was the first engine that was in the Suburban. And everything checked out with plastic gauge. And when I started it up, 2 minutes later, it started knocking. And I could not figure out what in the world was causing it. It had good oil pressure, the whole 9 yards. And that was the only time I ever used break-in oil. And it was Brad Penn break-in oil. So, all right, so how I normally do it is you take your oil here and you just dump it right in the lifter valley. And the reason why I do that is it goes all over the cam. Yeah, it washes out your some of your grease on the camshaft. But this is the critical part that needs this zinc oil, is the camshaft and lifters. So why not just dump it in there? And we're also going to find out how many quarts of oil this oil pan holds. So give me a second, we'll dump all the rest of the oil in and we'll get ready to go. All right, so we ended up with about 8 quarts of oil in here. Brings it up to the dipstick, the regular standard full mark. I'll probably never run it that full. To be honest with you, it probably needs about 6.5, 7 quarts to be fine. Plus it'll decrease the windage. But for break-in, I try to, you don't want to overfill, but you overfill. So generally you're looking at having enough oil in there so that there is no oil starvation issues, stuff like that. But so we got our Royal Purple pulled in, 8 quarts, poured in the motor. So now it's time to go ahead and give the drill a spin. All right, so it's already been, the drill itself, or the the priming tool here I'm using is for a small block Chevrolet, but it actually works just fine in the Buick. We have our oil pressure gauge line hooked in here, and here's our oil pressure gauge. Now we're shooting for, this motor should spin about 6,700, 7,000 RPM. And the rule of thumb is about 10 pounds per every 1,000 RPM that you're gonna run the engine. So I'm looking for right now at 65 pounds would probably be the ideal situation. I can always shim the spring in here to bring it up or bring it down. But this will give me a good idea of oil flow and how well oil flows. So we're looking for oil on all the rockers, the top of the valves, and you know, you'll see oil running down the retainers, and then, but that's the whole idea. So we'll go ahead and give this thing a spin. I'll start off in low speed. So we're looking at about 70 pounds of oil pressure. And it's starting to get up to the push rods now. You can see it dripping off.
5 minutes later.
All right, so we're dripping a little bit of oil here. So where is this dude coming from? It's coming from our gauge line? Yep, it's coming from the gauge line. All right. Let's see where that's coming from. All right, no big deal. I'm gonna kick the drill up into high speed if it'll run at high speed. All right, so we're starting to fill up over here, the drain back on this, and it may be that the motor is tilted a little bit one way or the other. I can easily figure that out, but we are starting getting the oil over here on the passenger side, which you can see it's starting to drain back now, which is a good indication that we have lubrication on all of them. So I've bumped it over about 100 degrees or so on the harmonic dampener, and we're gonna see how she goes now. So now you're looking at 80 pounds of oil pressure. I will have to change the spring, go to a lighter spring. I'm not a big fan of oil pressure being that high on these things. And you can tell it's draining the battery on the grill pretty quickly. Okay, so I just changed the spring in the oil filter bypass, or the oil pump bypass, which is going to regulate your pressure. I dropped it from the blue spring to the yellow spring, which is supposed to knock it down from 70 to 60 pounds. And before we had 80 with the blue spring in it. But now with the yellow one, we have 72 pounds of oil pressure. So I'm actually going to try to go take it down even further. So you can see blue spring, approximately 70 pounds. Yellow spring, and remember, we have a B housing, so you got to look at the B housing. If you had an A housing, the way you can tell is the oil filter here is clocked further out. It's not so close to this bypass spring on an A housing. On the B housing, they're really close together. Okay, so remember, we did the B housing when we did this. So the next thing to try, since we're at 72 pounds on a spring that's supposed to be 60 pounds, that means we're 12 pounds over. Here's a 40-pound spring, so that'll take us to 52 pounds. I don't think it's gonna go to 52 pounds. I think it'll probably be 54, 56, but I do need something a little stronger than that. So this is where an adjustable oil pressure regulator comes into play when you buy one from TA, and then just adjust that, or you can just shim it. So I'm thinking I'm gonna go with that orange spring and I'm gonna try to shim it up. So let me see what I can do. Pull this thing apart and get it dropped down to something reasonable. All right, well, I've changed the spring once again. This time we went down to the orange spring. The orange spring on the B housing is supposed to be 40 pounds of oil pressure, okay? And this is where all of that work you did in your oil pump, setting the end cut tolerances, porting it out, making it as large as possible, so they can flow. The volume over pressure is important here, but nonetheless, here we go. So we got an orange spring in there, which is supposed to be 40 pounds. All right, so you come over here, we give this dude a whir. There's 60 pounds of oil pressure. Okay, that's 20 higher than what it's supposed to be. So that's because of, I'm assuming because of all the work that's been done to the oil pump, why it's considerably higher. I noticed it dropped before when we changed the spring from the blue to the yellow, it went up to 12 pounds difference. And on the blue was supposed to be 70 pounds and it was at 82. So that was 12 pounds, but now it's even, it's not higher. The ratio is higher. So I believe it's because of the volume that the pump actually flows, why it's increased the pressure so high. Because it's, remember, pressure is directly proportionate to volume. So I would say that we're flowing quite the volume, and this bypass spring is reaching, let's say 40 pounds in the pump, but it's showing 60 pounds out here on the gauge, which is after the pump, which is a very good indication that things are gonna work out quite well. So we got oil on all the rockers. It's coming out all the push rods. It looks like our bypass is not, or not bypass, our balance tube is not leaking at all, which is good. The sad part is, up here at the front of the motor, it's leaking coming out of the fitting. It looks like it's actually leaking right here, maybe behind this first elbow, or it could be leaking at the top and running down. I can't quite tell. But either way, I'm gonna have to take that apart and then see if it's, if I can tighten it up some more, or if I need to get a different fitting or what. So we'll find out. I mean, I actually just took this fitting and there was a really small hole inside, about 1/8 of an inch, and I opened it up to 1/4 of an inch, but I don't see how that would impact its sealing. So we'll see maybe what's going on there. But right now I'm thinking it might be here at this elbow, just because it doesn't look like that this elbow is seated all the way in on the threads, like this one here is seated all the way in. So we'll see. All right, well, I will catch y'all later. Oh, hey, and don't forget, we're having an event called the No Name Nationals, Sykeston, Missouri, September 30th, October 1st. It's at Jeffers Motorsports Park. You can pre-register on nonamenationals.com. You can even buy pre-registered spectator tickets on there. You'll save yourself $5 on the spectator ticket. At the gate, it's going to be $20. Pre-registered is $15 a day. So make sure you head on over to nonamenationals.com and get yourself enrolled.